how's it going, everyone? Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Music Reviewer Podcast. Today we have episode 18. This is going to be an album review over the latest Ellie Goulding record, The Brightest Blue. And this is going to be, I believe, my first true pop album that I'm reviewing on this podcast series. Everything else has always been either like R&B, indie, alt. I guess Fiona Apple was more of like an art pop act. Um, but yeah, this is going to be Ellie Goulding's fourth album. Before we get started, I just want to let everyone know that there's the latest episode was over Oliver Tree's latest debut album, which I thought was really good. Um, Ugly is Beautiful. If you haven't checked that review out, go and check a look at that review. It is up on every single streaming platform that I'm on. YouTube, just type the music reviewer, you'll find it. So yeah, let's get started. So what had interested me in covering this Ellie Goulding record was really its kind of low-key release. There weren't any huge lead singles. There are some that I think were featured on the Billboard Hot 100 or charted, but really they don't really coincide with the main gist of this album, which is kind of a big overall topic, which will be the big overall topic of this whole entire review. Um, for those of you who aren't too familiar with Ellie Goulding, you might have heard her music if you were just alive in the 2010s. She had massive hits with artists like Calvin Harris, um, songs that were featured on movie soundtracks for movies like 50 Shades of Grey. Her career actually sprung in 2009 when she was signed to Polydor Records. Before that, she had come in contact with some European record producers, but that led her to being basically releasing an EP on Polydor in 2009. And shortly after that, releasing her debut album in 2010, Lights, which debuted at number one on the UK record charts. And in 2012, I guess things were more of a shift when she rose to prominence in the United States with her record release Halcyon, which featured singles like Anything Could Happen. And that album debuted at number 9 on the Billboard 200 in the US. And I would say that was kind of the beginning of her peak. This is when you saw her being featured on tracks with, like, I think Skrillex, who she, I believe, even dated, and Calvin Harris, and she kind of seemed to be like this rising star that was being featured on these EDM tracks that had this shining vocalist that, sings with this really shimmering vocal timbre that's like a little shaky, but at the same time, it's delivered very well. So after that, in 2015, she released her third album, Delirium, which had a successful lead single, On My Mind, which to this day I still really like that song. Which around this time, it seems that she had started to fade away from like the recent spotlight, even though she had some successful lead singles, and even she was even nominated for a Grammy for Best Solo Performance for Love Me Like You Do, which was the lead single off a movie soundtrack for 50 Shades of Grey. That was believed being her biggest hit. But it seemed like no one really cared about the actual album that was released, Delirium, and she kind of since then has faded away, kind of staying quiet. Her biggest hit still being prominent in the contemporary top 40 radio, but you don't really have a cult or passionate following for Ellie Goulding. I'd say it's really just casual listening. Um, Nonetheless, it was interesting that she released an album so low key in the summer with all these huge records being released. Taylor Swift just dropping a surprise album. These trap juggernauts like Pop Smoke, Juice World, and Kanye on the verge of releasing something. Um, Beyonce probably on the verge of releasing something. It just seems like this was a very low key album release. Not really, uh, not really successful lead singles coming out other than like one that featured Juice World, but of course that was going to chart because it featured Juice World. Nonetheless, the Brightest Blue seems to be an overall shift for Ellie Goulding in terms of her, uh, I guess, whole aesthetic. These really aren't cookie cutter pop songs uh, that seem to have been just produced for a pop artist like she was a few years ago. These seem to be a little bit more candid and personal. Um, but is it overall a better experience? Did the album strike me as being better as 2015's Delirium? And when I go back to Delirium, the highs on Delirium, like Don't Panic or On My Mind, at the end of the day are just solid pop songs. Uh, the Brightest Blue really is just this, it features about the same amount of highs in just a different variation. And I think that's what the overall takeaway is, that this album is more of just a different lens in Ellie Goulding's catalog. So the Brightest Blue basically is a different perspective onto what music she's able to uh, come up with and I guess write and perform. However, the overall album doesn't really captivate me or entice me to be more passionate about Ellie Goulding's music. Um, the album does feature some really nice songs, though. It overall is a pretty decent album. Um, it starts off with a track named Start, featuring Surfing with Feet, which I did a little bit of research on Surfing with Feet. That Surfing with Feet has been this kind of Baroque pop underground experimental artist in the northeast of the United States that has been sort of coming up as I guess, a feature on a lot of prominent artists over the years, but has still kind of kept his underground status. Um, the overall song doesn't really, I guess, captivate the feature of Surfing with Feet until like the end when there's like a change of character. The song is strange overall. It has like this bright piano instrumentation, these vocal manipulations, these rhythmic vocal passages, and these high moments that feature these quick vocal runs. It's somewhat of a low key track at moments, and it's somewhat down tempo. Um, didn't really strike me as a highlight overall, but the next track, Power, certainly did. It has this deep synth bass line supporting the track. It sounds really great. There's a sense of groove to it. That transition back to the second verse after the chorus is really great as well. The drum track with vocals with is a nice shift in the second part of the verse when it's a little bit more isolated. Um, the chorus, unfortunately, doesn't hit too hard. I'd say it's probably one of the weaker points of the song. The harmonized vocals sound a little bit muddy at times, but overall it's a straightforward track, saved by that deep synth bass line that I liked a lot. How Deep is Too Deep is another highlight that I thought was interesting. Um, it kind of features this songwriting style where there's a verse or pre-chorus where you is building up to like this typical pop radio drop, and it doesn't happen. It kind of just goes into like this uh, subdued instrumental interlude. The track has like a sense of ambience with like these industrial like percussive parts, these really wet synths. It's very rhythmic overall. This chorus, however, does hit a lot better than the previous track, so I think the song does have, some better qualities overall. It features that typical Ellie Goulding shimmer in her vocal tone. I don't know if I talked about an introduction to what I was talking about Ellie Goulding, but one of the things that made Ellie Goulding stick out to me, at least, was her vocal tone and how the color that it produces when she sings at times is kind of unmatched. Even though she's not the greatest vocal talent in the world, she certainly holds her own when there's this holds her own in the sense of being distinct in the world of music. Honestly, there's really no other voice like hers that I've heard. Um, and then also, How Deep is Too Deep has this nice, colorful instrumental outro. There's a lot of filler in between this track and a few more tracks over. I think like three more tracks over. I'd say one of the takeaways in this part, where one of the next big songs, "Love I'm Given," is really just the next song after "How Deep Is Too Deep." There's a quick transition, and then this track, "Love I'm Given," really just struck me as being a kind of like alt pop radio grab. It reminded me a lot of Bishop Briggs style, with like these kind of like big choruses and like these, these rhythmic parts with like these drum machines. It stylistically, it draws a lot to that. Um, it panders a lot to that alt music aesthetic. There's a gang vocal part, and you can really hear those qualities in like the tempo, the drum track, and the overall song structure. Um, I'd say that was a takeaway from "Love I'm Given." Um, the next two songs didn't really strike me as being too important. There's kind of just like these low key qualities to it that kind of are just very emotional songs, that kind of make this album different than her previous albums. But it kind of faltered in that respect, where it didn't really hit the mark, until we got to "Woman," which it's a piano singer songwriter style song. Um, there's a kind of like a sparkly pristineness to it, very musical theater like, very something that we haven't really seen from Ellie Goulding. Um, it has these pretty bright embellishments thrown in. It has a typical raspy vocal tone. The string orchestra is featured in here, which is really featured on a lot of the other tracks, the previous two. There's a washed percussive track in the last chorus that is kind of oddly similar to like a Sugar Roast track. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but I thought that was interesting. It's just very thick with these textures and strings thrown in at the end. The song uh, keeps a nice build up overall, and it's not overbearing. I thought that was a highlight. Tides was another interesting one. It kind of reverted back to like this alt rock, not alt rock, but like alt pop, indie pop flavor. This track in particular has a lot of indie pop flair going on. It's basically like 1975 style production, with like these electronic elements thrown in and like these samples. Let's see here. The vocals sound manipulated at times with maybe pitch correction. There's like a strained vocal part, I'd say. Like that's something that kind of stood out to me. And the track kind of evolves into like this drum track coming in with these vocal samples, and then Ellie Goulding vocalizing on top of that, and there's kind of like a pseudo chorus. And later on in the song, when the chorus finally hits, it doesn't really pay off. Unfortunately, it doesn't have like this big moment that it was trying to, build up to. The next track, however, is interesting because it's like an interlude track, but it has like this short, Emojin Heat type style vocal harmonization with auto tune. I thought that was really interesting. That was thrown in, and it leads into the song "Bleach," which is very like R&B esque, especially on the vocal style. It's accompanied with like this acoustic guitar, so it's like SZA style like, and there's like these small vocal runs that happen. There's variations thrown in the second verse. It has a nice transition to the chorus. The instrumental overall has a bit of like tranquilness. There's a particular chord in the guitar that's struck throughout the whole entirety of the song. I think it's just back and forth between two chords. That kind of like gives like this relaxed feeling overall in the track. The next track, Flux, is kind of like a ballad type track. I'd say overall it kind of falters because it just has this very elongated last chorus, and it reiterates the same line constantly, and it becomes a little dry after a while. Um, and that leads us to like the last track, Brightest Blue, which is probably the most ambitious track on the album. It's very lush sounding. There's some very nice things about it. However, the there's this one part where she keeps on going up to sing the note where she says blue, and it's a little piercing, and that happens several times. The track also has like these spoken word type verses. It's kind of sing talked with like these rhythmic stanzas that are utilized. There's like these counter melodies thrown in the chorus that are a nice feature. It follows the same pattern where you go for that big last third chorus, which was my problem with the last track, previous track. And it's understandable since this is the last song on the album. They're just going for that very big, grandiose moment. Um, However, I think it kind of just didn't quite hit the mark. Um, and that kind of is just the end of the album. There is a B side that has the quote unquote, I'd say, hits that were supposed to probably chart. There's songs with Black Bear, Sway Lee, Diplo, Juice World, and then another song called 16, which kind of reverts back to Ellie Goulding's like original aesthetic with like these early 2010s pop flair. Kind of think of it 16 being like Katy Perry's Teenage Dream, but it just doesn't hit as hard and it's less pleasing. The song with Juice World isn't bad. It's easily the best feature she has on this part of the album. But overall, I'm not really covering these tracks because they don't really fit the aesthetic of the overall album, and I don't think they're really meant to. Um, Overall, they didn't make the album any better either. So I'd say this album is a 6 out of 10. Uh, Overall, I like the fact that it gave a new perspective on Ellie Goulding's music. It wasn't like these cookie cutter pop songs a lot of the times. The overall pieces of music that were given on this album, unfortunately, are a little unfocused. It seems like it tries to be uh, this really candid work of art with these emotional moments, but sometimes they just don't really translate all that well to what it's trying to hit, I think. Um, but check this album out if you're even remotely interested in Ellie Goulding's music. You might really like it. But yeah, that's the end of the review. And if you stuck around this long, thanks for listening. My name's Josh. I'll be dropping a few more episodes this week, especially Best Worst Track of the Week. But yeah, take care of yourselves.